Most people think they know what happens when a narcissist loses someone. They imagine the narcissist simply moves on, finds someone new, acts like nothing happened. And from the outside, that can seem true. You might see them posting online, smiling in photos, acting confident, keeping busy, living their life as if the relationship never mattered. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, it can be confusing, because part of you starts to wonder if they ever cared at all, if the connection meant anything, if the time, energy, and emotions you invested were simply forgotten overnight. But the reality is often much more complicated than that, because what affects them isn't always the loss of the relationship itself, it's the loss of certainty, the loss of control, the loss of someone they believed would always stay, someone they assumed would keep forgiving, keep explaining, keep understanding, keep making excuses for behavior that should have never been tolerated in the first place. Someone they expected to keep giving second chances long after those chances had already been exhausted. And when that person finally walks away, something begins to shift. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, and certainly not always in a way that's visible to other people. But psychologically, a process often begins. A process they may not fully understand themselves. Because losing someone who constantly validated them is different from losing someone they never valued. When a person they relied on emotionally is no longer available, when the attention stops, when the reassurance disappears, when the predictable pattern they counted on suddenly breaks, they're forced to confront something uncomfortable. The possibility that this time is different. The possibility that you're not coming back. And for someone who always believed they had another chance, that realization can be surprisingly difficult to accept. Today, we're going to explore the 6 psychological stages many narcissistic individuals experience after losing someone they never expected to lose. Not everyone will experience these stages in the exact same way, and not every person with narcissistic traits reacts identically. But the patterns we're about to discuss are remarkably common, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why their reaction often has less to do with love and far more to do with losing something they thought would always belong to them. Because the real story doesn't begin the moment you leave. The real story begins the moment they realize you're not coming back. The first stage is denial, but denial rarely looks like denial. Instead, it often looks like confidence, indifference, or even relief. They may act happier than ever, post more online, appear socially active, throw themselves into new distractions, and to anyone watching, it looks like they've moved on effortlessly. Almost as if the relationship meant very little to them. Almost as if your absence created no emotional impact whatsoever. And for the person who was left questioning everything, that can be one of the most painful parts. Because you expect some sign that the connection mattered, some indication that your presence had value. But instead, they appear completely unaffected. Yet psychologically, something else is happening beneath the surface. Accepting the loss would require acknowledging that someone chose to leave. Someone decided they were no longer willing to tolerate the behavior, no longer willing to keep sacrificing their own well-being to maintain the relationship. And for a narcissistic personality, that's difficult to process, because it challenges the image they have of themselves, the image that says they are always desired, always important, always in control of the outcome. So rather than face that discomfort, they often create a story where the relationship didn't matter, where they're actually better off, where losing you was insignificant, where your departure says nothing about them and everything about you. Because that version of events feels safer. It protects the ego from having to confront uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why did they leave? What pushed them away? Could my behavior have contributed to this outcome? Those are questions that require self-reflection. And self-reflection can feel threatening when it risks exposing flaws they'd rather ignore. So instead, denial becomes a shield, a way of avoiding the emotional weight of what has happened. But underneath that story, the reality hasn't fully registered yet. They're still expecting things to return to normal, still assuming you'll eventually reach out, still believing that the emotional pattern they've grown accustomed to will somehow resume. Because in their mind, this may feel temporary, just another conflict, another pause, another situation that will eventually resolve itself. And that's why the next stage becomes so important. Because eventually, the silence lasts longer than expected. The messages don't come, the attention doesn't return, and reality begins to break through. Slowly at first, then in ways that become impossible to ignore. At first, your absence feels temporary, but then something starts to happen. Days pass, weeks pass, and the expected message never arrives. The apology never comes. The pursuit never returns. And slowly, the certainty they once felt begins to disappear. This is where the first real psychological shift begins, because now they must confront a possibility they never seriously considered. What if you're actually gone? What if this isn't another argument, another temporary separation? What if you've genuinely moved on? What if this time, the door they always assumed would remain open has finally been closed? That possibility creates discomfort, because for someone who relied on predictability, your independence becomes unsettling. The person they expected to remain emotionally available is no longer behaving according to the script. The reactions they counted on aren't happening. The emotional access they once had is no longer guaranteed. And for the first time, they begin realizing that they may no longer have the influence they once believed they did. And that creates confusion, because the outcome isn't matching their expectations. They expected you to reach out, expected you to miss them, expected you to eventually return to the familiar pattern. But instead, they're met with uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for anyone, especially for someone who is used to feeling in control. Confusion leads to anxiety, and anxiety leads to increased focus. The more time passes, the harder it becomes to ignore what's happening. Small reminders begin to carry more weight. A memory, a photograph, a conversation. Even hearing your name can trigger thoughts they were trying to avoid. Because reality is becoming more difficult to dismiss. The possibility that you've truly moved on starts to feel real. And once that realization begins taking hold, something else often happens. Their attention shifts. The person they were trying not to think about suddenly occupies more space in their mind. Not because they've fully accepted the loss, but because they're beginning to recognize that things may not return to the way they were before. And that growing awareness creates a new psychological response, one that often catches them completely off guard. Which brings us to the next stage. This is the stage where denial becomes harder to maintain. Reality starts showing up in small ways. Mutual friends mention your name. They notice you're living your life. You seem happy. You seem calmer. You seem less affected than they expected. And suddenly, the narrative they've been telling themselves begins to crack. Because if you were supposed to need them, why are you doing okay? If they were supposed to be unforgettable, why are you moving forward? If they believed you would eventually come back, why do you seem to be building a life without them? These questions create an uncomfortable emotional tension, a tension they often try to avoid, because answering those questions honestly would require confronting a reality they don't want to face. The reality that your world didn't stop when they left it. The reality that you are capable of healing, capable of growing, capable of finding peace without their presence. And for someone who expected to remain emotionally significant forever, that realization can feel surprisingly unsettling. But the more evidence they see, the harder it becomes to ignore. They notice changes, changes in your energy, changes in your confidence, changes in the way you carry yourself. You no longer seem focused on what they're doing. You no longer appear trapped in the emotional cycle they once relied upon. and every sign of your progress challenges the story they've been telling themselves. The story that they were the center of your world. The story that you would always remain emotionally attached. The story that your happiness depended on them. As that story begins to weaken, reality becomes more difficult to dismiss. And that's when something unexpected can happen. The person who seemed completely unaffected may start paying much more attention than anyone realizes. Not always openly, not always directly, but internally their focus begins to shift. Because what was once easy to ignore is now becoming impossible to overlook. Your absence is no longer just a temporary inconvenience, it's becoming a fact. And the more real that fact becomes, the more their attention is drawn toward it, which sets the stage for the next psychological response. At this stage, curiosity often turns into preoccupation. They start wondering what you're doing, who you're talking to, whether you've met someone new, whether you're happier without them. They may check social media, ask mutual contacts questions, or quietly monitor your life from a distance. Not necessarily because they miss the relationship, but because your independence challenges something deeper. It challenges their belief that they remain central to your world. For a long time, they may have assumed that no matter what happened, they would continue occupying a significant place in your life. That even after conflict, distance, or separation, your attention would somehow remain connected to them. But now they're seeing something different. They're seeing evidence that life is continuing without their involvement. You're making decisions, creating new experiences, building routines, and moving forward in ways they didn't expect. The more they see evidence that you've built a life without them, the harder it becomes to dismiss your absence. Because your absence is no longer theoretical. It's visible, it's real, and it's producing outcomes they never anticipated. The person they expected to remain emotionally attached appears to be adapting, growing, and in some cases, thriving. That realization can become difficult to ignore because every sign of your progress challenges the assumptions they once held. The assumption that they would always matter most. The assumption that you'd eventually return. The assumption that their influence would remain intact regardless of what happened. As those assumptions begin to weaken, their attention often increases. They become more aware, more curious, more focused on details they previously ignored. Not because they suddenly understand your value in a healthy way, but because the situation no longer feels predictable. And when predictability disappears, the desire to regain certainty often grows stronger. Which is why another need begins to emerge, a need that will drive much of their behavior moving forward. The need to restore control. This stage often surprises people because it's the moment when communication suddenly returns. A message, a reaction, a comment, an unexpected attempt to reconnect. From the outside, it may look like reconciliation, but psychologically, something deeper is often happening. Control has been lost, and losing control can feel deeply uncomfortable, especially when someone is no longer responding in predictable ways. So they test the connection. They test your availability. They test whether they still have influence. Because influence reassures them. It restores certainty. It reduces the discomfort created by your absence. The response itself often becomes more important than the conversation, because every reply tells them something. It tells them whether they still occupy space in your mind, whether they can still affect your emotions, whether the connection remains accessible. And when uncertainty has been building for weeks or months, that reassurance can become very tempting to seek. So they reach out, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes in ways that seem casual or insignificant. But underneath those actions is often a desire to measure what remains, to see whether the door is still open, whether the dynamic they once relied upon can still be restored. But if those attempts fail, if you remain firm, if you continue moving forward, then they encounter a stage they hope to avoid, because eventually, testing the connection no longer produces the answer they want. And that's when reality becomes much harder to escape. This is the stage where reality becomes unavoidable. The relationship is over. The dynamic is over. And the version of the future they expected is no longer available. For some narcissistic individuals, this creates anger. For others, resentment. For others, deep frustration. Because they're now forced to confront a truth. Not everyone stays. Not everyone accepts the same treatment forever. Not everyone can be controlled through guilt, manipulation, or emotional pressure. And whether they admit it or not, that realization leaves a mark. Because your absence becomes evidence. Evidence that their actions had consequences. Evidence that someone chose themselves. Evidence that the story didn't end the way they expected. Perhaps most importantly, it becomes evidence that another person was capable of walking away and continuing forward. That realization can challenge assumptions they've carried for a very long time. Assumptions about control, about influence, about entitlement. And while they may never openly acknowledge those lessons, the experience often remains with them. Because the hardest thing to accept isn't always losing the relationship. Sometimes it's accepting that someone found the strength to leave it behind. And that's often the hardest part to accept. If there's one thing to remember, it's this. The most powerful part of your story isn't what happens to them after you leave. It's what happens to you. Your healing, your growth, your peace. Because while they may go through psychological stages of reaction, you have the opportunity to go through psychological stages of transformation. And that's the difference. One path focuses on losing control. The other focuses on finding freedom. One path remains attached to the past. The other begins creating a future. One path is driven by resistance to change. The other is built upon embracing it. And while it's natural to wonder how someone reacts after losing you, there comes a point when that question becomes less important than another one. What are you becoming because of what you've been through? Because real healing isn't about proving your worth to someone who couldn't see it. It's about recognizing your worth without needing their validation. It's about learning that peace doesn't come from changing another person. It comes from changing what you're willing to accept. Every boundary you set, every lesson you learn, every step you take toward a healthier and more balanced life becomes part of that transformation. And over time, something remarkable happens. The person who once spent so much energy trying to understand someone else begins to understand themselves. The person who once chased answers begins finding clarity. And the person who once feared being alone discovers strength they never knew they had. That's why your story doesn't end when the relationship ends. In many ways, that's where a new chapter begins. A chapter built on self-respect, growth, confidence, and freedom. And in the end, freedom is always worth more.